I think if we're going to talk about old houses, we have to think about several things. First of all, at the beginning, this was the edge of the settlements, and people coming here necessarily built log cabins. So the very first things were log cabins. Then there were a series of events which occurred and which have an impact on the type of houses are built, where they're built, and what have you. First of all, there had to be a sawmill, because if you were going to get away from the log cabin era, you had to have something to call saw planks. And Joseph Keyes built his sawmill here in 1839, as you're well aware, and almost immediately they started building some frame houses. Brick houses didn't appear for quite a while. First of all, there had to be brick masons, and I believe it was the William and John Harbeck who arrived in 1848, and also they were brick masons. Also, there were some local people, particularly Philander Everson and Casper Steinfort, and also a Truman Hoyt at about that time, who started making brick locally, and that's about the time when brick houses appeared. Now you have to have a place to put these houses, and rather than being scattered haphazardly, you have to have lots and plats, and Chester Patterson provided that, as you well know. In 1842, he bought about 80 acres of land in the area around here and proceeded to plat at least about 2 streets around the park all the way around. He didn't keep this very long. He almost immediately started selling lots at it, and we will see a couple houses which are related to that. Most, of course, disappeared. Miles Millard, when he arrived in 1843, said there were only 14 houses in the whole town. So you could see there weren't many, but they were frame houses. The first one supposedly was built on the Madison Street Hill just down from here, and that one was later turned or moved over to be part of the old American House Hotel, so it didn't remain. Then there were other, well, first of all, he sold the bulk of this land as bulk to the Pickett's, Armin, and Roswell, and to Miles Millard, and they in turn proceeded to sell lots off this batch, shall we say. And then there were others who bought land from them and proceeded to make new plats. There's Isaac Fargo, who platted Fargo's first and second addition, which is primarily along North Main Street and going on Scott and Franklin and extending all the way to Norton and to Mulberry. And then Enoch B. Fargo, who had his plat, which was essentially part of Oak Street and Washington Street, and that was 1882. Kelly Atwood in 1857, and Cook and Atwood in 1857 also platted lots which were Grand Street and which were essentially what we call College and Fremont Street. So with this as an introduction, and I'll get on with the houses. Now, this is a brick which we salvaged out of the old brickyard. Many of you probably know that the original brickyards, particularly of Everson and later Krause and During and Green, was just about where the police station is now. And it was a cream-colored brick. Casper Steinfort made brick, which was red. This is a suggestion of the early log cabins, and as you recognize, this is taken out at the Aztalan Museum. Unfortunately, it's not a really local one, and I'm a little disappointed because some of you remember back in 1941 they were removing houses to build Highway 30 through the hills and so forth, and lo and behold, when they're stripping down the one house, they found an old log cabin, which was indeed the Carmichael cabin. Colonel Carmichael drove, if you'll believe this, a herd of 600 sheep all the way from Ohio to here and proceeded to buy most of the land of the north and of the west side of the lake And his cabin was on what we call Old 89, up near where the county park is now. Unfortunately, I don't know what's happened to this. They moved the cabin to over near where Fred Greenwood was living. And I don't know what's happened. I have this old clipping here for some who you are not familiar with it, and you can look at these afterward. Well, I've done enough of an introduction here now, and we'll start with the rest of it. This shows the original plat of Lake Mills in the dark lines, which Chester Patterson platted, and as I say, it was about 80 acres, and it included the mill pond and the mill. The very first house that still remains, I'm going to have more light somehow, okay, is the Joseph Kai's house. This was built, or part of it was built, in the spring of 1843, and it still remains. It was sold to the William Phillips and Charles Phillips families in 1849, and they lived in it for a good many years. We know it more commonly as the Ferry House, or more currently the Hanson House or Joe Storr's house. But this is the oldest remaining house in Lake Mills. Obviously, it was not this large originally. There have been many additions onto it. In the basement you can see hand-hewn beams with part of the bark on them, but this was not uncommon. You can find this in many of the older houses in Lake Mills. They didn't pay that much attention to their basements. And so this house has it, but a number of the others do. Now this house is on Oak Street, but it didn't start out there. And a lot of these houses were moved. This house was built on a lot bought from Patterson by George Hebbard. George Hebbard was a teamster, among other things, and he built his house on the very far corner of Madison Street and East Lake Street, where the red brick house is now.
Do you need more light?
I could use a little more.
Okay.
A flashlight won't do much.
Okay. I'll see if I can set this up.
At any rate, he built this house in 1843 or thereabouts and proceeded to live in it. He didn't live in it too long. Eventually it was sold in the 1870s to a Marcellus Newton, who at one point had a cigar factory in Lake Mills with his brother. He also had other houses, but he had moved to this by that time. He also was one of the early owners of the Lakeview House on the other corner on Madison and North Main Street. And he sold this house then in 1895 to O.B. Coombe, who was a man with Reed who had bought the Fargo Mercantile building on the corner downtown, and they had a general store there for about 18 years. But in 1895, Coombe bought the house, and he moved the Hebbard house over to Oak Street, and this is approximately the way it looks now. I'm not sure who's in it. A variety of people lived in it at one time or another, including Dr. Weber, and also Robert Brown, who was a postmaster. More currently, it was a Volker who lived in it, and there have been a good many others since. This house, I'm sure a lot of you recognize because it's right along the park. It's often claimed it's the oldest house in Lake Mills, but I cannot confirm this at all. In 1846, Roswell Pickett sold the house to Edward Abbey. In 1852, Edward sold it to his son Henry. It was about that time that the house was built, probably between 1846 and 1852. Virginia Maligue currently owns the house, and her father had for a good many years. She says in the basement there's a reference to 1843, and I'm not sure what that refers to, because except that the Abbey sold it to Enoch Harvey, and the Harveys had arrived in the Lake Mills area about 1843, but they were on a farm near Aztalan. Abbeys were primarily teamsters. They also had livery stables in town. And Enoch Harvey, I'm not sure exactly what work he did. His son, of course, was a blacksmith. In 1843, it was sold to August Wegman, and the Wegmans owned it up until 1921. And then it was kept in the family, including the son Carol. Chris Lindbergh's lived in it for a number of years in the 1920s, and Otto Maligue bought the house about 1936. Essentially, it is a rental house now. This is another very old house dating back to 1847. It was the first house that Enoch B. Fargo built, and it's on East Lake Street, just around the corner from the Red Coombs house. In that year, Miles Millard sold the lot to the Fargos, and a few years later, Enoch Fargo sold it to his son Isaac Fargo, but he remained in the Fargo ownership for a long time. About the end of the century, 1899, Isaac Fargo sold it to Eliza Nelson, and she in turn traded it for a farm. Subsequently, it was owned by other people. Charles Glassell, who was a meat dealer or an animal dealer and had meat markets in town with Charles Keene, bought the house about 1914, and he kept it until the Depression, when he lost it through foreclosure. Subsequent to that, Bob Mell was in it, and more currently, Bill Ferry has been it. This is a picture of it with the Glassells in it, and this is the way it looks today. Treptows are now the owners of it. This is another house that had a little moving to go with it. Originally, about 1847 or 1848, Reverend Seward built this house on the corner of Madison and Mulberry Street. And he kept it for a number of years. He then sold it to George Edgerton, who was a realtor not only in Lake Mills, but in Chicago and also in Minnesota. Edgerton's kept it primarily as a summer home, and they lived in it. One of Edgerton's daughters married C.T. Fargo, or as we know as Don Fargo, and they were married in the house in 1878. About 1896, Conrad Inksberg bought the house and the lot and proceeded to move the house back, and then about 1912, the house was moved from there over to Water Street, and Chris Burkles moved into it. And this is the way it has looked. As you know, Fred Burkles lived in it also, and he built his first greenhouse adjoining this. It now looks like this, and Don Inksberg is the owner. I forgot to say that there are approximately 7 houses from the 1840s era which still remain, and about 11 from the 1850s. This house was built in 1848 by a Dr. Eliab Joslin. Sort of interesting that Joslin was involved in a variety of things. He had his medical education Going back into the 1830s in New York State, he subsequently practiced in New York and in Ohio before coming to Wisconsin. After he'd been here a few years, about 1855, he sold the house to a Dr. H. Gregory, who then lived in it for about 6 or 7 years. Joslin went on to be one of the founders of the Republican Party, and he then gravitated to Washington, D.C. He became a surgeon during the Civil War, went back for a civil service job in Washington, D.C. after that, and subsequently ended up in California. After Dr. Gregory, it was sold to Sam Lewis. Well, Sam Lewis is a name that will come up a couple times here. He bought Fred Seaver's first blacksmith shop, and he also at one time owned the general store, which we know as the Fargo General Store. He sold this house eventually to William Hoskins in 1866, and this is about the way the house looked at that time. More currently, it looks like this. It became part of Clinton Jenks's estate. Fred Jenks lived in it for a good many years, and at one time, as you remember, this also served as sort of a summer hotel. More currently, Don Klein has owned the house and now is owned by the boys of the Fargo Mansion. This is another rather old house, going back to, I would say, probably the early 1850s. This is at the top of Madison Street Hill, and it was sold by Miles Millard to Isaac Atwood. And I would have to believe that Isaac probably built this house. I relate more to the ownership with a Madison Arlen. Madison Arlen had been here in the early 1850s. He was the proprietor of the Lakeview House at the hotel down at the foot of the street for quite a while. He then sold that and went over to Waterloo, where he ran an Arlen Hotel. But then in the 1870s, he came back, and Julia Atwood sold this house to Madison Arlen. Madison Arlen was sort of getting on in years, although he worked as an editor for the Spike newspaper periodically. On his death in 1847, it was sold to John English, and it's a rather convoluted history, and I'm going to try to share it with you a little bit. One of Madison Arlen's daughters was a Louisa English, who married an Edmund Veeder in 1857, and they had a daughter, Florine, or Flora, as you probably know her. And the Veeders were around here. He was a primarily railroad man. After he died, Mrs. Veeder married John English, and so this is how Flora Veeder became sort of attached to the English family. Well, after Arlen died, his wife married a Ben Odiorn, and they lived in this house for a good many years. And when she died, then it went through a number of people's ownership, including an Addie Myers. Finally, in 1926, Reverend Messerschmitt Schmidt bought the house from the Myers and proceeded to live in it with his granddaughters, one of whom married Maynard Betzold, and Maynard Betzold's lived in this house for a good many years. I'm not sure who currently lives in it, but it has remained. One thing you notice that a lot of these early houses were rather small. There's good reason for this. It was very hard to keep warm in the winter around here. People did not live on the lake. It was suicide to do anything like that, and the houses they did live in were very small. There are some pretty good examples just north of the old Methodist church. They're still there. They're small houses, and a lot of them were really little more than cottages. It wasn't until central furnaces came around in about the 1870s, and particularly when steam heat became available in the 1880s, that larger houses were built. And we can thank the Fargo Company for some of that, because their expertise in building hot water service for their creameries and for their equipment, led them to get into building hot water systems and steam systems for a number of the houses in town. This is another house that has a pretty old history. As far as I can tell, it goes back to about 1852 and probably was built by a John Merriam, who was a early shoemaker here in Lake Mills. Eventually, he sold it to a Mary Avery, and then it went to a John Fisher, who was an early tailor in town, and still in the 1850s. And then to Manly Thayer, and then to his son Andrew Thayer, who was the grandfather of Claude Jones. And then about 1896, it was sold, a little later than that, 1901, it was sold to William Alexander, who had moved off his farm near Fayetteville Grove. He bought the Andrew Thayer house. His daughter was Mrs. Jane Dietrich, and so after his death, about 1940, the Dietrichs moved into the Alexander house and lived in until her death. Another old house built in the 1850s was that of Philander Everson. Philander came in the 1840s and originally had a farm in the Aztalan area. About 1848, he moved to East Lake Street, about where the funeral home is now. And a few years later, and that's when he had his brickyard there. And in 1853, he moved to South Main Street and built this house, which is still there. He died in 1860 with a horse and wagon accident, and subsequently his son William Everson moved into the house. His daughter was Fanny Mills, and she was born here. More currently, it looks like this. Frank Everson's son, Tom, subsequently lived in, and his wife still lives in it. It's still there on South Main Street. I've used this old pictorial map of Lake Mills to illustrate the next one. This is on the corner of Washington and North Main Street, just across from the Methodist Church. Isaac Fargo was the first landowner, and after he had platted his Fargo's first edition, he sold it in 1853 to a Mary Jane Shout, and it was about this time that she built the house. And it is still there. It is a brick house. As you see, after 1848, more and more houses are being built of brick. Sort of an interesting side view of this is that Virginia Malig tells me that with the house on Madison Street, her father decided to change the siding on it one time, and when they took off the siding, they found out that part of the house is indeed brick under it. As you notice, there is a rather interesting side door, which I doubt is probably not used anymore. It was bought by an Andrew Saltz later, and then Silas Hitchcock, who was also a one-time proprietor of the Lakeview House, and before the Newtons were. In 1916, it was sold to Gus Yandry, the father of Ora and Henry Yandry, and after his death, Ora and Henry Yandry lived in it, particularly one we call Doc Yandry lived in it, and it still is in the Yandry family. Another early brick house was that of Robert Fargo's. He bought this lot from his father, Isaac, in about 1853 and proceeded to build a brick house there. He lived in it until about 1867 when he sold it to a Jesse Meyer. And the Myers then lived in it for 30 years until it was sold to Alex Buchanan, Archie's father. And in 1904, Buchanan sold it back to the Fargo family, and this time to C.T. or Don Fargo, who proceeded to live in it. It subsequently, after his death, went through several ownerships and currently is that of the Wayne Crones. This is the way it looked probably when Robert Fargo was living in it, and this is the way it looks today. There have been additions onto that too, as you can see. Just across the block, if you will, is a large brick house, and this is the one built by William Griswold, again on land sold to him by Isaac Fargo in his Fargo's first edition. And so this house was built about 1855. It was in the Griswold family for a long while. George Griswold lived in it. His son Fred was born there, and Fred's sons William and Fred also lived in it. This is the way it looks today. It's been pretty much rental property for a long time. Another little brick house. I had a lot of difficulty tracing this one down, and I finally went to the Jefferson County assayer's office, and they were able to help me quite a bit. William Chapin, who I know nothing about, built this house in 1855, and a year later sold it to Silmans. It subsequently went through a very large number of people, including Greenwood's Bank, which they took it over because of a failed mortgage. More currently, it was owned by Frank Mosh, who is Marvin Mosh's father, and the Moshes lived in it from 1907 till, I guess, the 1940s at least. Oh, went the wrong way. This house on College Street, also underneath the boards, is a little brick house. It was sold to a Solomon Doty about 1858, and I would have to believe that he probably built the house. And about 1875, he sold it to John Kaltenborn. John Kaltenborn was the one who had one of the early hardware stores in town, down where the Fargo Mercantile Company is now and where C.T. Jones had his grocery. But anyway, Kaltenborn kept it till 1881 when he sold it to Oliver Hurd. Oliver Hurd was also a businessman in town, and he in turn sold it to Clumps. Eventually in 1922, it was bought by the Paul Wolfs, who kept it until 1967. So probably the longest ones who lived in that were the Paul Wolfs. Interesting sidelight on this, there was an Anna Cleveland, who was the wife of Washburn Cleveland, and they were married about 1860, and he had worked in a mill somewhere between Lake Mills and Madison. He died about 1872, and his wife was rather destitute. The only thing she had was his mill tools. She sold those to buy a sewing machine, and then moved to Lake Mills and lived in this house. About 1880, she left and moved to Iowa and remarried. This house is on the top of Madison Street Hill, and it looks quite modern, but actually it was built about 1858. Miles Millard, who had bought property, as you know, from Chester Patterson, sold it to a George Blanchard. George Blanchard was involved with the Lakeside House. It seemed like a lot of proprietors of that old hotel also had houses on Madison Street. He also ran a livery stable at one time or another, but he was the one who built this house. And the reason I'm willing to believe that is because he took a mortgage out in 1858, and after that time the price of the lot and so forth went up. 1869, Blanchard sold it to Marcellus Newton, the name we've heard before, because he also later owned a house on the other end of Madison Street. About 5 years later, it was sold again to Sam Lewis. As I said, you're going to hear this name Sam Lewis several times here because Sam kept moving around too. He sold it to John English. John English sold it to a William Hilliker, who was primarily a carpenter. And it went through a number of hands, and I'm not going to go through all of them. In 1919, it was sold to William Daynard, who was a carpenter, and so some of you may remember. A couple years later, Daynard sold it to Barbara Christ, and when she died in 1938, it became the property of Maud Christ, who probably more of you remember. In 1941, Maud sold it to Ed and Bertha Grunewald, and when Ed Grunewald died, then it was sold to the clan Klockos, and Mrs. Klocko, who married Reverend Glasser, still owns the house. Whoops. This is not a very good picture, but it probably depicts the way it looked quite a while. This was the original Moravian church and parsonage up on the top of Fremont Street Hill, and it remained their property until 1889, when it was sold to William and Mary Crump, who bought the house and proceeded to improve it. And it was at this time, when this picture was taken, that the house looked this way. Crumps lived in this house for quite a while. In 1928, they sold it to first an R.Q. Quick of Rome, Wisconsin, and a year later to a Louis Hoffman. It went through several ownerships after that. Tom Neubauer bought it as a distressed house in 1936 and proceeded to live in it for about 20 or 30 years. The Les Webbers bought the house from Neubauer about 1956, and currently it is owned by Lester Smith. Fred A. Seaver, the knife maker, lived in a variety of places in Lake Mills, but this seems to be the only house that he has remaining. They bought this house from E.B. Fargo. E.B. Fargo seemed to have bought up a lot of the land along West Lake Street, and he sold this particular lot to Fred and Sarah Seaver, who built a house there about 1861 or 1862. And the Seavers continued to live in this for a long time. Now, there's some controversy of whether they lived across the street where you see the three where the original knife factory was. I can find no evidence that they lived there. It was sold by Seaver in 1884 to a W.W. Ingram, who proceeded to build a brick house on that particular lot, and so we'll get to that a little later. With Fred Seaver's death, this was sold to Zeno Kipke in 1913. And after his death, Francis Kipke continued to live in that and used it as a boarding house for a good number of years, which she called the Pines. And after she married Ora Woodkey, they continued to live in this house in the 1940s. About 1980, it was bought by the Blackmans, and I'm not sure who currently owns the house. The house right next to it was bought a year later by Ernest Voigt, who proceeded to build a small house there. It seems that he rented it most of the time, and a lot of people were in and out of it as a rental house. I'm not going to go through all the different names. The Voigt sold it to a Schneider in the 1920s, and Mary Ferry bought the house in rather decrepit condition. It was being used as a boarding house by Lydia Pouch at the time in 1927, and Mary Ferry made quite a few improvements on it, and it looks pretty much the way she'd had it. This house is on Franklin Street, and a number of you will recognize it. Miles Millard sold the lot to Isaac Fargo in 1852, and Fargo promptly sold it to an R.W. Bryant, who apparently did little with it. It was a double lot, and the house, which is just to the right of this, was built on the other half of that double lot a little later. In 1864, it was sold to William and Lydia Foster, and they were the ones who built this brick house. They, in turn, sold it in 1884 to P.C. Henningsen, who was a very active contractor in town. And in 1889, he split off that other lot. He had built a house on it. And in 1890, he sold the house to Emil Stilke, and the house is still in the Stilke family. That means I have to change my slides. This old brick house is on Grant Street, and we come across the name of Sam Lewis once again. And he was the one who built this house in 1866. It went through a lot of ownership, including William Phillips, who owned it at one time. In the 1940s, Robert Bennett owned it, and in 1946 he sold it to Ben Hahn, and the Hahns lived in it for quite a while, and I'm not sure who is in it now. Heim Street's own it, but there's someone else living in it, I think. Or is Heim Street living in it? Okay. Yeah, Bob Heim Street currently owns it. It was owned by Vogel before him. Well, this pretty little house, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you recognize it, and it's had a lot of additions and improvements over the years. Originally, the lot was sold in 1867 to L.A. Hildreth, who was a blacksmith in Lake Mills, and the Hildreths lived in this for a good many years. His daughter married Dr. William Engsberg, and after the Hildreths moved out of it, and they were quite elderly at that time, Mrs. Engsberg owned the house, but then she sold it first to a Henry Trachte, who was a piano tuner and sold pianos along with the Cook family. He in turn sold it to a Stats, and it moved rather rapidly in the 1918 to a Frank Wolfer, and from then to a William Sinden. In 1927, it was sold to Theron Black, who was Harley Black's son, and he lived in it for a number of years before moving to Columbus. In 1934, Black sold it to Lee Wilson, and Lee Wilson lived in that until he died. This is another old house with many additions. I will call it the Steinfort House. Caspar Steinfort came from Germany about the 1860s. He was a silk manufacturer in Germany at that time, but he did not do any manufacturing after he got here. He did have a little brickyard. He also had some side of a fruit orchard up toward the cemetery area, and he owned quite a bit of area to the north of this house. He had bought 25 acres from William Hoskins in 1867 when he built this house. In 1888, he sold it to his son-in-law, William Prignitz, and when William Prignitz died, then it became sort of rental property, and there were usually two families living in it. Martin Body lived in for a good many of years, and I believe he probably owned it during that time, and subsequently it became the Aztalan House, and I'm not sure what it is right at the moment. Another rather pretty brick house, which has had a lot of additions and changes to it. This house was built by Levi B. Leonard in 1868. Leonard originally had come to Lake Mills to study medicine with a Dr. Du Bois. He had been a hospital steward in the Civil War with Dr. Du Bois, but he sort of lost interest in that and went into agriculture for some reason or other, and as I say, in 1868 he moved from the Favo Grove area to North Main Street and built this nice brick house. One interesting factor, he also owned about 40 acres in back of the house, and he built a racetrack, horse racetrack there, which flourished from 1881 till about 1888. On his death, George Warner bought the house, and somewhat later Oscar Hildebrand, who some of you may remember was a furniture dealer and mortician. Oscar didn't keep it too long. It became a rental property. August Gables lived in it, and Max Kelch lived in it. In the 1950s, Al Zerbach bought the house, and then he subsequently sold it to Larry Radel, and the Radels, of course, have done extensive remodeling of this now. Well, this is Robert Fargo's second house. He had sold the other house, and he had moved to a variety of places. He bought this house from his brother E.B., or not the house, but the lot from his brother E.B. Fargo in 1868. And in 1869, he built this rather nice brick house, two-story, which he called Heart Ease. He lived in it for about 30 years. Then he sold it to an A. Fuller, and this then became rental property. In 1920, Charles Panzer, who was a local photographer in town, bought the house from Robert Fargo's son. And in 1928, Panzer's traded houses with Dr. Thompson of Madison for the Thompson's house in Madison. And Dr. Thompson moved here and had a medical practice in his house. His son Willard subsequently lived in it, and now his grandson is living in the house. As you can see, at one time it had a very fine cupola on it. More currently, that has been removed, and this is the way it looks currently. I seem to have something out of place here. This is the George Bishop House on South Main Street, built about 1877. In 1880, he built a conservatory wing on it, which I suspect is this one projecting to the left side. He lived in for a good many years after his death. It was rented by his wife to a variety of people, primarily business and professional people. In the early 1900s, it was sold to Otto and Herman Miller, who were implement dealers in town, and Otto Miller lived in it until the 1940s. It was sold eventually to Limps, and then to length, length, Marvin Lengths, and most currently it is owned by Ruth Deppy. Now I'm back in order. Another house that moved. Originally this house was on Oak Street. It was built in 1877 by Joe E. Harvey, and it's remained there for a good many years. In 1899, Joe Harvey sold it to Alice Harvey, and subsequently a number of people lived in it. But in 1920, Mrs. C.J. Millard bought the house and moved it from Oak Street over to the lot which she had bought from Charles Panzer, which is on East Lake Street, right between the Coombs house and the E.B. Fargo house. In 1923, Mary and Phillips Ferry lived in this house, and in 1926, Mary Ferry was still living in it. However, it was still owned by Mrs. Millard, and she owned it into the 1940s, and subsequently Stilke's were in it, and currently Lois Anderson is in it. Another small house which has a hidden brick building somewhere in it. This is on North Main Street, somewhat across from the Methodist Church. It was probably built about 1873 by a Fred Buss, who promptly sold it to his son Charles Buss. Charles Buss had a dray service and also a livery service in town. He sold it to Oliver Cass in 1881. Cass had a livery stable, and he sold it in the same year to his partner William Elliott. Elliott, a year later, sold it to J.P. Miller, and Miller's kept it for a long time. In 1898, Miller's daughter, Mrs. Kramer, owned it, and subsequently in the 1930s, Henry Yandry owned the house, and I'm not sure who was in. Bratz has lived in it for quite a while. This old brick house was built in 1877 on South Main Street by John Tummy. Tummy had lived in the Aztalan area for many, many years. He'd come in the 1840s, and he owned not only this lot, but all the lands of about 4 acres all the way down to the lake. In 1892, the Tummy house was sold to E.N. Harvey, and a lot of people consider this more to be the Harvey house, and Harvey then built his cottage down the lake, and many of us remember the old Harvey cottage. Harvey didn't live in this too long. He moved off to the farm. Harvey was a blacksmith, and he also owned or lived in a variety of other houses before this, and we'll touch on that. Anyway, Ted Smith bought the Harvey property, and in turn, in 1908, Paul Groff bought the house from Ted Smith and lived in it for many, many years. And again, I'm not sure who owns it currently. Frank Fargo also bought a lot on Mulberry Street from his father, Enoch B. Fargo, and about 1877 built a rather modest house on, yeah, it is modest now, I know, but on Mulberry Street. He was one of the first ones to burn coal in his furnaces in Lake Mills. Well, it was a smallish house. It was brick. He made a variety of additions onto it. I just read the other day where about the 1899, I think it was, he made extensive additions onto the back end where he built a new kitchen, a refrigerator, and a dining room, a variety of things. Apparently he was in somewhat competition with his brother Enoch J., who had subsequently bought the house on the corner from William Harvey. And most of this bric-a-brac and decoration which is on the house was built in 1896. He died in 1920 after being hit by an automobile, And in 1923, it was either sold or rented to the Ladies of Good Counsel Summer Home. And this is the way it looked at that particular time. In 1930, Frank Fargo House was sold to an H. Schuler, who tried to turn into apartments. He also had an Elm Manor clothing shop here when they refused to give him a liquor license. He got into all sorts of trouble, and a variety of people have owned it. Subsequently, it is essentially an apartment house, and Vince's own it now. Here's another little house up in the top of Fremont Street. It was built about 1879 by C. Deming. A couple years later, it was sold by him to Chris Smith, who had a farm connected with it. And this is Mrs. Caroline Smith, or Schmidt, sitting in front of it. This is Henry Schmidt's, or Smith's, grandmother, and he was very kind to supply me with this picture. About 1960, the house was sold to William Punzel, and it has remained pretty much a small house as such, right on the top there. Down at the foot of Fremont Street was a small house, probably built by C.G. Conklin in 1878. Now this is not the house, this is the lot across the way. This is the house. In 1881 it was sold to a W. Hardin and became known as the Hardin House for a good many years. In 1887 Hardin built a new bathhouse, and I suspect it was about this time that they started building tourist cabins and so forth in there. Many people lived in the Hardin house. Hardin was usually living elsewhere. He was originally from Madison. In 1926, Ben Woodkey bought the Hardin place, and he also had these little tourist cabins down there. Maud Miller tells me that when she was young, her father and family lived in the Hardin house. But pretty much the house remained as Ben Woodkey's up and his sons up through the 1960s. Another old frame house, and this one on Oak Street. I'm sure a number of you will recognize it because it's quite visible from East Lake. Miles Millard sold the lot to a William Fleming, and in 1851, who apparently did little with it, but in 1878 it was sold by Margaret Fleming to Amelia Ann Hunter, and I believe the house was built about that time. Subsequently, it was sold to a Lipke and then a Minnie McGovern. In 1907, it was sold to a Frank O. Kipke, who was Caroline Topol's grandfather. About 1930, Carolyn Woodkey Kipke became the owner of the house, and they owned it for a good many years until it was sold to the Robert Mells in the 1940s. And most currently it has been occupied by Russ Miller. Another old brick house, this one on Mulberry Street across from the Fargo Mansion, built by Hans J. Anderson, who was the old inventor and who had a variety of enterprises. He had married Lorenzo D. Fargo's daughter, so he had a rather close association with the Fargos. In 1879, he bought this lot from E.B. Fargo and promptly built this nice brick house. About 5 years later, he sold it to his father-in-law, Lorenzo Fargo, and L.D. Fargo continued to own the house, although he rented it and lived out on his farm until 1900, when he eventually moved back to town and lived in the house. More recently, it was owned by the Leroys, and it's been a rental house, and I'm not sure again who owns it. This is a very small cottage and essentially it's still a cottage. In 1879, some fellows from Indiana, Carter and Folsom, bought lots and built this little cottage. And it remained a cottage on the bottom of Lakeview Avenue for many, many years. In 1900, the Carter cottage was sold to Frank Foote, who owned the house nearby. He in turn sold lots to William and Bert Howe, who built the houses on the corner where Zastro and I'm not sure who in the other house now, but they both built substantial houses on the lakeshore in 1901. And this sort of went along with the Will Howe house. Farney's bought the Howe house and apparently owned this also. Subsequently, people by the name of Bergman, who was sold fire engines, lived in it, and Arneson, who was a rural mail carrier. Finally, in 1940, Frank Shanewetter bought the house on the corner and also owned this. So this is an old cottage going back a good many years and has become a permanent residence. William R. Harvey built this house at the corner of Mulberry and Franklin Street in 1879. A year later, he sold it to a Dr. R.T. Bishop and built a new house where the E.J. Fargo house is now. We'll get to that in a second. Dr. Bishop owned this house for a couple years and then sold it to an A.B. Smith and moved on to other pursuits. And the Smiths continued to own it for about 20 years when they sold, and was sold eventually in 1917 to Mrs. T.J. Willie, who bought it from the Smith's daughter, Ellen Bernard. And it remained in the Willie family for a good many years. Part of it was rented out. Robert Hoyts lived in the first floor at one point in the 1920s. About 1950, Leonard Wall bought the house, and I think his widow still lives there. Well, this very pretty house has a history that relates very much with the Phillips. It was built in 1880 by Reverend D.J. Jenny, who had married the sister of the Phillips, William and Charles, and he died a few years later. In 1893, the house was sold to William Howe, who we've just heard about. Will Howe was the one who had the boat livery on the lake for many, many years. In 1901, Howe, when he moved to build his house, he sold this to a W. Halstead, and Halstead kept it about 20 years and then sold it to a T.B. Roach. And a couple years later, it was sold to Henry Strobel, and the Strobels then lived in the house through the 1940s, and eventually Paul Helms lived in it, and more subsequently there are other people owning it. Now, this is an old house, or old picture, and you can see the way the Frank Fargo house looked before he really modernized it. This is a house on the corner of Mulberry and Washington Street, which was built by William Riley Harvey. William Riley Harvey had a general store in connection with Robert Fargo at one time back in the 1860s. In 1870, he built his own general store, which is part of the Heim Street drugstore right now. A few years later, he sold out to his partners and became a commission merchant in Chicago and left town, but he then sold this. He built this house in 1881, and 3 years later he sold it to E.N. Harvey, and Harvey continued to own it until he sold it to Enoch J. Fargo in 1896, who promptly brought in architects and built the rather elaborate mansion which you see here. After the his widow eventually sold it to Pop Went, and this is pretty much the way it looks today as the, oops, getting a little better focus, as the Fargo Mansion. Another house on North Main Street, right next to the L.B. Leonard House. David Cole, an early druggist in Lake Mills, bought 2 acres from Sam Lewis's widow in 1881, and the next year built a nice new house of brick. 2 years later, he had sold his drug business to Conrad Inksberg, and he moved to Iowa. And subsequently, the house was sold to a Griffey, and in 1890, Rush Fable bought the house, and when he died in 1912, it became the property of Reverend John Fable. And about 1920, Mrs. Stickles and Gladys Fisher moved into the house and lived in it to the 1940s. About 1950, Art Ream bought the house, and a number of people have owned it since. This house is right next to the Jenny House. It's just north of it. It was built by Walter Delos Millard, who had married a Jenny Foote, and he bought the land from George Bishop, who had the house right next door, bought part of the lot. However, in 1885, he sold the house to a Joseph Warren, who in time, about 4 years later, sold it to a Yandry when he built a new house. Then Mrs. Hooker owned it in the 1890s. August Cleats bought the house from Mrs. Hooker in 1902, and he proceeded to live in this until he died in about 1933. Subsequent owners have been Phil Wolfe, and now the Don Clarks are in the house. Another little cottage house, which is on Lakeview Avenue, built by W.W. Ingram, who had bought 3.5 acres from Hornicle on and about the lake in 1880. He built a nice little park there with a summer house, but in 1883 he built a new cottage, and this was the cottage. It remained the property of his wife until 1901, until Ingram Park area was sold to A.W. Greenwood, who was to build his own nice house down on the lake. And Greenwood almost immediately sold the cottage to Reverend Odoms. Odoms winterized the cottage in 1923, and it became a permanent residence of his daughter, the Bentleys, and this is her daughter, Mrs. Eskridge, and finally now the Lyras. After Hans J. Anderson sold the brick house on the corner of Mulberry and Washington to his father-in-law, Lorenzo Fargo, in 1885 he built this nice house on Washington Street on the north side of the street. And he remained in this house until 1909, until he sold it to August Strasberg. And the Strasbergs remained in this house until the 1950s, when eventually Phil Inksberg bought the house and modernized it. And I'm not quite sure who lives in it now. Now we're getting back to the old knife factory. Fred Seaver bought the lots from E.B. Fargo in 1868, but it doesn't appear that he ever lived there. It seems that more he built his first knife factory there because he was already living across the street in the frame house which we saw before. At any rate, in 1884, when he had moved his knife factory over to the mill pond, Fred Seaver sold this to W.W. Ingram. W.W. Ingram was quite an entrepreneur. He was from Chicago, well, he was originally from New York, but he made his headquarters in Chicago, and he came out mainly in the summers. Uh, he was one of the first ones to promote the harvesting of ice from the lake and was instrumental in getting the Washington Ice Company to build their big ice house down there. Of course, he owned some of the property across the lake, which he also sold to them for potential building purposes. But he also did harvest some ice. Another interesting facet, when they had the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, he built a 40-room hotel in Chicago just for the fair visitors. So you see, he was a rather active man. Anyway, he built a nice little brick house here in 1884, and subsequently Ingram sold the house to Ed Redig in 1892, and it's been in the Redig family ever since with certain modifications. Time to change. We'll recognize this house, of course. This was built on a lot bought by Ernest Voigt from E.B. Fargo in 1868. However, he did not build a house on it until 1884. Try and make that a little sharper. And he continued to own this house until 1904, when he sold it to Ora Woodkey, and the Ora Woodkeys subsequently continued to own it, and now it is owned by Art Topos and Carolyn Topo, who is Ora Woodkey's daughter. When W.D. Millard sold that little gray house across South Main Street to Warren, he then built this rather nice house in 1895, this brick house on the east side of South Main Street. Subsequently, it was sold to J.W. Hansen. Other owners were John Jockel and William Phillips. Eventually, it was sold to Frank Dodge, and probably most of you remember it as Frank Dodge's house. Dodge changed it to a duplex in 1922, and it has been pretty much rental property ever since, even though Dodge's, or Mrs. Dodge, was still living it in the 1950s. This is the house next door. It was built in 1888 by A.W. Greenwood, the banker. He lived in it until he moved to build his house on the lake shore. In 1904, it was sold to Walter Yerke, a sometime saloon keeper, sometime auto dealer. Walter sold it to Dr. Pinn in 1909, and eventually it was owned by William Christoffels, and finally by Homer Jinxes in 1922, and Homer Jinxes lived in it until the 1950s, and it was sold to the Methodist minister at that time, and it's been owned by a variety of people ever since, and usually has been a duplex type of situation. This house was built by Royal Hassam in 1888 on South Main Street. He died in Royal was a furniture dealer and also became a mortician. His building he built about the same time on East Lake Street, where the older part of the dime store now is. And he also had other houses before this, but he built this in 1888, and when he died in 1892, his wife married a Kellogg George Kellogg, who had nurseries both in Janesville and in Lake Mills, and was constantly advertising his wares in the Lake Mills Leader. William English was a nephew of Mrs. Hassam, and when she died in 1914, William English moved into this, and it became the English property for a good many years after that. In 1954, Mrs. English, his wife, was still living in it. This nice house on College Street, which at that time was called North Street, or North Lake Street, I should say, was built in 1889 by J.J. Kent. J.J. Kent kept moving back and forth. He lived in Rome, Wisconsin at one time. He went back and forth. He'd been a railroad agent at one time, I believe, also. But anyway, he moved back here for good and became a realtor in Lake Mills. He bought this lot from, which is next door to L.A. Hildreth's, in 1899, and proceeded to build the house. And it was sold to a Dr. T.J. Buckley in 1924. And in 1926, it was sold to Phillips Ferry. And Phillips Ferry owned it for a good many years. Eventually, it was sold to the David Andersons, and I'm not sure who Lois sold it to. This is a house that has a history of the brickyard. It was built by Charles Krause, and he and his partner William During ran the brickyard, which was pretty much just behind this. This house is a brick. It was built in 1889. It was sold later to some Clumps, and Mrs. Omar Keyes is the granddaughter of Charles Krause, so she was able to supply me with some of the information. The oldest part of the house is that on the right side. August Lang built this brick house on North Main Street next to the Leonard House in 1897. Subsequently, it was sold to the Lutzes, who owned it, and it was rented out. Otto Nodlers lived in here at one point. Harold Richards lived in it. Harry Haverkates lived in it. And in the 1950s, it was sold to Walter Kuby, who lived in it until his death. Another interesting brick house, which is right next to the hotel. It was, and also next to the Hassam House. It was built in 1890 by H.J. Douglas, who was the owner of the mill at that time. And he kept it until he bought a house on Fremont Street. In 1920, he sold it to Henry Strasberg. And about 1940, it was sold to Peter Fortuna. Currently, it's owned by Barry Luce. Well, this is the George Bruns house, which he also built about 1890. He also owned the lots behind it and proceeded to build 3 rental cottages there. This, of course, it was designed by Mr. Hooker, who was an architect in Lake Mills at the time, and is obviously a very substantial house and still is owned by the Bruns family, Marion Bruns. David Fraser, who came very early to Lake Mills in 1848, was part of the agricultural company complex at one time, subsequently became a partner with William Griswold and the Griswolds in a farm implement business. Built this house in 1891 on Madison Street, right next to the Coombe House. In 1914, it was sold to a W.M. Cook, and subsequently was sold to William Korth, and the Korths lived in it until their deaths. This rather interesting cottage was built in 1891 by Bert Howe and Mrs. Myers as a double cottage, and it was used primarily as a summer cottage for a good many years. In 1907, it was sold by them to Nodines. Nodines were people from Milwaukee. He ran a piano business in Milwaukee, and they would come out here in the summertime. When things got bad in the Depression, they actually moved out to Lake Mills for a few years, and they winterized the place. About 1940, it was sold to Peter Petruska, who remodeled it into apartments, and it has been owned by a number of people, including Harold Gessner, since. And it essentially has apartments in it. This is the Dr. David Earl House at the corner of Mulberry and Washington Street. About 1887, Dr. Earl bought the house on the lot, as it was said, between C.F. Greenwood and George Griswold's. Well, he moved the old house off and moved it down to the corner of Washington and Reed Street and proceeded to build this house in 1891. And unfortunately, he stepped on a nail in the area while the house was in progress and died, and so he never really got to live in this house, but his wife, Fanny Kendish Earl, did for many, many years. Rather interesting, the house is essentially of brick, and is brick which was gotten from the old evangelical church down on the corner of Oak Street, which was torn down to build a new building. He bought all the brick and proceeded to use it for his house. As you know, it subsequently was the Canic Nursing Home, and others have owned it since. I put this house in not because it's so old, but I'm intrigued with the very narrow windows which are in it. It was built in 1892 by Charles Kiso, who was the father of Sam Kiso. He traded it rather shortly to a William Neff, and eventually was sold in 1910 to Charles Yandry, the father of Irvin Yandry. And in 1918, Irvin Yandry became the owner of it and still is in the Yandry family. This house on South Main Street was built by Mrs. C.C. Williams in 1893. Her son was E.A. Williams, the one who built the Williams Block, the big brownstone building downtown. And they continued to own the house until about 1914. And Dr. Baer was in it, Dr. Pinn was in it. Usually as a rental property. In the 1920s, it was sold to Ralph Inksberg, and his daughter still lives in it. This is the C.J. Millard house, the original one. We talked about Mrs. C.J. Millard, who built or moved the house onto East Lake Street. She was the second Mrs. Millard. The first one had died, and she married C.J. Millard about 1896 when this house was built. When he died about 1920, then the house was bought by Otto Yerke, and it is still in the Yerke family. This is the Cal Ayler house, which many of you recognize. Cal was a long-term businessman in town. Originally, he was with George Bruns in the hardware business. They parted ways, and Cal Ayler eventually became he was a carpenter for a while, and then he subsequently became a furniture dealer and a mortician. He built this house on a lot bought from Mr. Terry in 1896, and he lived in it for a good many years. Eventually, the Wolfs were in it, Mrs. Elsie's parents, Carl Wolfs, but it was stipulated that they should always have a room there for Cal. This is the William Wood house, which was built in 1899 on the site of an older house which had been owned by his father-in-law. About 1922, it was sold to Dr. Light, and in 1931, Dr. Light moved to his newer building or house on West Lake Street. It was subsequently rented to a Mrs. A. Henderson, who ran a hotel in it in 1932 for about 1 year, and when that failed, it was sold to C.W. Schultz, who bought it and opened a funeral home in it in 1933. Well, that's the end of my presentation. I know you have questions on a variety of things. I'm just going to flash through a number of 1900s houses, and then we can talk later. This is the A.W. Greenwood House. This is the Coombe House. This is the Garth Everson House. This is a house built by a Dr. Stair and subsequently owned by E.L. Mills. This was built by Robert Copeland, subsequently sold to Hoskins, has remained a furniture funeral home. And this was built by John Jockel and subsequently sold to H.J. Setz. This was built by S.A. Reed, who was a partner of O.B. Coombs, subsequently owned by a variety of other people too. This was built by Victor Ravenhill, supposedly constructed as like the prow of a ship. This was built by E.C. Brown after the old Oak Grove house burned down, and subsequently owned by the Hippenmeyers and the Armentrouts. And this is the Frank Everson house. This was built by Lou Crump. Lou Crump built a variety of houses. This was a rather nice one, I thought, of stucco. He also built the house that Dr. Bleecker owned eventually on College Street. And this is a house built by Smiths in 1926 and currently the Armentrout House. And that's all I have to say, but I'm willing to answer any questions.